Hello, Daddy. Please save me. I need your blood. Park Sun-woo's hand stilled on the document he had been reviewing. It was past midnight in Seoul. He was not a man who startled easily. He said nothing for a moment, stared at the far wall of his now dark office. His mind was running through the possibilities rapidly. Wrong number, prank, some kind of error, and finding none of them satisfying. When he finally spoke, something happened to his voice that he had not consciously intended. It softened. "Who is this?" he said carefully. He didn't know why he was careful. She was a stranger, a child on the other end of an unknown number calling him in the dark. But something in him, something that had been buried so long he had forgotten it was there, did not want to frighten her. "I got your number from my mummy's phone. She kept it." The little girl sniffled, a wet, fragile sound that cut through the silence of his office with unexpected precision. And then she began to cry softly. Sun-woo did not hang up. He didn't know why. He simply stayed, holding the phone, saying nothing, letting her cry, and when the storm had passed enough for her to breathe again, he finally spoke. "Who is your mother?" he asked. Her voice came back, steadier now. "Cassandra Edwards, but all her friends call her Cassie." The world stopped. The distant city noise disappeared. The document in his hand was crushed entirely, the paper folding inward under the force of his grip, without him registering any sensation at all. Cassandra Edwards. Cassie. 6 years. 6 years since he had heard that name spoken aloud by anyone. 6 years of building. 6 years of expanding the empire, closing the deals, becoming more powerful and more untouchable. Because movement was the only thing that worked when stillness meant thinking about her. Cassandra Edwards, the woman he had fallen in love with at first sight 7 years ago, the woman who had left him with nothing but a brutal text about how she regretted ever meeting him. Cassandra Edwards, the woman who had set his heart on fire with a never-ending furnace of grief, hatred, and intense yearning. The woman who had turned his life upside down and destroyed his peace. He was on his feet in an instant, phone pressed to his ear. He breathed in, breathed out, recomposed himself the way he always did. He gripped the phone until his knuckles were white and his hand was steady, and he spoke clearly. "Tell me where you are. I'm coming to meet you." He lost her for 6 years, found her again through their daughter, and almost lost everything in one devastating night. When little Fiona makes a desperate midnight call for her father's blood, she reunites two hearts that were never meant to stay apart. But just as love begins again, danger strikes. One child, one call, one unforgettable second chance at love. Welcome to Afro-Korean romance cinema, where love walks the edge of danger and endings are never predictable. If you're new here, hit subscribe and join the tribe. But real quick, what time is it where you are and where are you watching from? Drop it below. I love seeing how far this story travels. And be honest, are you already hooked? If yes, smash that like button and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss what's coming. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. To understand why that phone call mattered, to understand what it cost Park Sun-woo to hear that name after 6 years of silence, we have to go all the way back to 6 years ago, to the evening in Seoul that changed everything. The evening a woman named Cassandra Edwards saved Korea's most powerful mafia boss's life. She had been in Korea for 6 months by then, part of a university exchange program from New York. She was 23 years old and had come with 2 suitcases, a fearless curiosity about the world, and absolutely no idea that her life was about to be redirected by a man bleeding out on the side of a street. It was raining the day it happened. Cassie had been walking back to her dormitory from a bookshop, an umbrella in one hand, and a paper bag of groceries in the other, when she saw him. He was on the ground near the mouth of an alley, a tall man in a dark suit, slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to his side. The blood had soaked through his shirt and was beginning to pool on the wet pavement. The rain was washing it in long pink rivers toward the drain. Most people had walked past him. In a busy city, it was almost possible to convince yourself it wasn't real, that it was a film shoot, a prop, someone else's emergency. Cassie had stopped. She had put down her groceries, knelt beside him and called for help. She had held her scarf against the wound and spoken to him the whole time, in English, because her Korean was still learning to walk, telling him he was going to be fine, that help was coming, that he needed to stay with her. He had looked up at her then, dark eyes, half glazed with pain, focusing on her face with an effort that she could see was costing him something. "Who are you?" He had rasped. "Someone who isn't going to let you die on this pavement," she had told him. "Now stop trying to talk." He had almost smiled. Almost. She had ridden with him in the ambulance, sat in the hospital waiting area while they stabilized him, and gone home only when she was told he was out of danger. She had visited the next day, and the day after that, because she could not have explained why, but the not knowing felt worse than the knowing. She told herself it was human decency. She told herself anyone would have done the same. His name was Park Sun-woo, and when the haze of pain medication began to clear, she discovered that he was terrifying and sharp-tongued and deeply, deeply uncomfortable with the fact that a foreign exchange student had quite possibly saved his life. He did not know how to say thank you. It seemed to be a phrase that sat awkwardly in his mouth, and so instead he had looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, "You're not what I expected." "You expected something?" Cassie had asked, raising an eyebrow. "You were barely conscious." "I heard your voice," he said simply. She had not known what to say to that. She still thought about it, years later. He healed. She kept visiting. What began as something she couldn't quite name began, slowly and then all at once, to reveal itself as something she couldn't quite stop. Park Sun-woo was not a warm man. He was precise, controlled, used to a world that moved according to his design. But with Cassie, cracks appeared in the architecture of all that control. He laughed more than he was comfortable admitting. He listened to her, not the way powerful men sometimes listened, with the performance of patience while waiting for their turn to speak, but actually listened, like what she was saying mattered, like she mattered. In those early hospital weeks, she would bring him books she thought he would like. Dense things, business histories, the occasional novel she wanted to argue about. And he would read them and argue about them, and their conversations had a quality that surprised her, heat without hostility, challenge without cruelty. He was sharper than anyone she had ever talked to, and he seemed to find the same thing in her. He looked at her sometimes mid-sentence with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Like she was a problem he found himself genuinely interested in solving. She was not supposed to fall in love with him. It was not the plan. She was in Korea for a semester, not a lifetime, and he was Park Sun-woo, a man whose name made other men's assistants apologize in advance. She told herself the hospital visits were courtesy. She told herself the conversations were simply the result of two intelligent people finding each other in a confined space. She stopped telling herself these things the night he told her, quietly and without any performance of casualness, that he had never once in his life looked forward to seeing someone the way he looked forward to seeing her. He had said it while they were sitting at opposite ends of a hospital corridor waiting for the lift, said it to the middle distance, not to her face, in the tone of a man making an admission that cost him something. She had not known what to say. She had taken his hand, which she had never done before. He had looked at the joined hands and then at her with that dark, unreadable expression, and had not let go for a very long time. And Cassie, warm, wholehearted, always giving Cassie, had fallen in love with him the way she did everything else, completely, without a safety net, without a backup plan. They dated for 5 months. 5 months that Cassie later thought of as the happiest of her life. Walks through autumn Seoul, the city burning copper and gold around them, late nights in his apartment cooking food. They had no business cooking because neither of them was actually that skilled in the kitchen, but the trying was its own kind of pleasure. His hand finding hers in the dark at the cinema with a certainty that felt like a promise. Sunday mornings when she would wake first and lie still, watching the light change, listening to him breathe, feeling the absolute specific weight of being happy in a way she had not known was possible. He did not say "I love you" easily. It was a phrase that sat in him like something from a foreign language. He understood it, he felt it, but the saying of it required something that cost him. But he said it with the way he cleared his entire schedule when she was sick and brought her soup she had not asked for, with the way he remembered things she'd mentioned once, weeks later. A book she wanted, a restaurant she'd passed, a song she'd said she used to love. He said it with the way he looked at her in unguarded moments when he didn't know she was watching, like she was something he had found after a long time of not knowing he was searching. Like she was, in some specific and irreplaceable way, the answer to a question he hadn't been able to articulate before she appeared in his life. She had believed it, all of it. Right up until the morning, everything fell apart. Sunwoo's mother, Madam Park Soo-yeon, had known about Cassie from almost the beginning. She had been watching. Soo-yeon was a woman who had spent her entire adult life building her family's position in Korean society, brick by strategic brick. She had married strategically, raised her son strategically, and had every intention of seeing him marry strategically. Love was a luxury the Park family could not afford to indulge when there were alliances to be made, empires to be fortified. She had identified Lim Hee-jin years ago as the ideal match for Sunwoo, daughter of the Lim group, beautiful, educated, from a family whose business interests dovetailed beautifully with the Parks. The merger of those two families would have been as much a business arrangement as a marriage, and Soo-yeon saw nothing wrong with that. She saw everything right with it. And then Sunwoo had gone and gotten himself shot, and fallen in love with an American exchange student who had no family connections, no fortune, and no last name that meant anything in Seoul. Soo-yeon was not a woman who panicked. She planned. She waited until she was sure, until she learned from one of her sources that Sunwoo was selecting an engagement ring, and then she moved. She sought out Cassie alone, without Sunwoo knowing. She arrived at the coffee shop near Cassie's dormitory dressed impeccably, her expression pleasant and composed in a way that should have been the first warning. She had told Cassie that her son intended to marry someone else. She had produced photographs of Sunwoo and Hye-jin at various events, functions, dinners, occasions that had perfectly innocent explanations, but which Soo-yeon presented with the practiced neutrality of someone allowing the worst possible interpretation to do its own work. She had said, in that gracious, terrible voice of hers, that Cassie was a lovely girl, exotic, interesting, exactly the kind of distraction a young man might chase before settling into his real life. She had told her that the union between her son and Hee-jin was not merely personal, it was necessary, for the business, for the family, for everything Sunwoo had built. And she had asked Cassie, woman to woman, to be the one to end things. Because Sunwoo, she said, was too loyal, too proud, too stubborn to do it himself, even when staying with Cassie was costing him. Cassie had walked home that afternoon with Soo-yeon's words turning in her chest like something she couldn't dislodge. She had not wanted to believe it, but doubt once planted has roots like weeds, and then, one terrible week later, she had watched Sunwoo absorb the news of a collapsed business deal, the one that Hee-jin's father had given to a competitor in what everyone knew was a pointed message about the importance of family alliances. She had watched his rage, and she had read it wrong. She had looked at his fury and seen, not a man who refused to compromise his love for a business opportunity, but a man who regretted the choices that had cost him that opportunity. She had been wrong. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was that she loved him too much to be the reason he suffered. What she knew was that the last thing she ever wanted was to be an anchor around the neck of the man she loved. So she had made a decision that cost her everything. She had packed while he was at work. She had taken nothing that was his, left nothing that was hers. She had sent a message from the airport, 2 lines that she had written and deleted a dozen times, then finally forced herself to send before she could take it back. Being with you was a mistake. I'm in love with someone else. She had sent it and turned her phone off and wept for the entire 14-hour flight home to New York. She hadn't known yet that she was carrying his child. She found out 6 weeks later, in a pharmacy bathroom in Manhattan, staring at a test result with shaking hands and a heart that could not decide whether to break further or to feel, inexplicably, like it had been handed something irreplaceable. She had thought about going back, had drafted the message more times than she could count, but she imagined how he must have felt reading her words, had imagined his pride, his fury, the damage she had done, and she could not bring herself to believe she would be welcomed back. She could not bring herself to put him through more, so she had kept Fiona, raised her alone, and loved her so fiercely and so completely that most days it was almost enough. Almost. The hospital corridor was pale and bright in the way that hospitals always were, indifferent to the human dramas playing out inside them. Cassie sat at the edge of Fiona's bed, holding her daughter's small hand in both of hers, trying to keep the fear off her face. Fiona was 5 years old and small for her age, and possessed of a mind that constantly astonished the adults around her. She was watching her mother right now with dark, intelligent eyes that were far too perceptive for her years. "Mummy," Fiona said quietly, "you're doing the face." Cassie blinked. "What face?" "The one where you're scared, but you're trying to look like you're not scared. Your eyebrows go like this." Fiona attempted a demonstration with her own eyebrows that, under any other circumstances, would have been hilarious. "I'm not scared," Cassie said, and then, because Fiona could always tell when she was lying, "I'm a little scared, but I'm mostly just focused on making sure you're okay." "I'm okay," Fiona said, with the serene confidence of a child who had not yet fully grasped the gravity of what the doctors had been saying. "Dr. Kim said my appendix is angry. I told him that's silly. Appendixes don't have feelings." He laughed. "He did. He said I was very funny." Fiona considered this. "I know." Cassie laughed despite herself, laughed and felt it dissolve immediately back into the fear that had been sitting in her chest since that afternoon, when Fiona had bent double in pain in the middle of their kitchen, and Cassie had called an ambulance with one hand and held her daughter's face with the other. The surgeon had explained it clearly: inflamed appendix, made more complicated by Fiona's anemia. The appendectomy could not wait much longer. The problem was the blood, O negative, Fiona's rare type, and the blood bank was dry. Every minute the surgery was delayed was a minute the appendix moved closer to rupturing. Cassie had called Amy in tears. She had said without meaning to, because sometimes fear unlocks things you've kept sealed for years. "The only person I know with O-negative blood is Sunwoo, Fiona's father, and I have no idea how to even begin that conversation." She had not known Fiona was awake. She had not known small ears were listening. She didn't find out until the doorway of Fiona's hospital room suddenly contained a man she had not seen in 6 years. Broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, wearing the expression of someone who has just crossed an ocean and has a great many questions. Cassie's hands went cold. He looked the same. That was the first ridiculous thought. 6 years, and he still looked the same, that severe, beautiful face, the kind of stillness that made a room aware of him the moment he entered it. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the warmth she remembered, not the tenderness, something harder, something that had learned how to be hard. "What are you doing here?" she managed. "How did you—" He didn't answer her. He walked to Fiona's bed, and something in his face shifted, the hardness cracking just slightly at the edges. "Hi," he said, and his voice had a different quality than she'd ever heard from him. Careful, gentle, the voice of a man taking something seriously. "I'm Park Sun-woo. I believe you're Fiona." Fiona looked up at him with an expression of intense, unblinking appraisal. She had her mother's eyes, Cassie sometimes thought, or rather, she had her father's eyes looking out through her mother's face, which was not a thought Cassie allowed herself often because of where it led. "You came?" Fiona said. Not like a question, like a conclusion she had already reached. "I came," he confirmed. "I called you," Fiona told him solemnly. "I found your number in Mummy's phone. It was blocked, but I unblocked it. Mummy showed me how to unblock numbers once in case of emergencies. I decided this was an emergency. Cassie's breath caught. Fiona, I heard you, Mummy, Fiona said, swiveling those unnerving eyes toward her. When you were talking to Auntie Amy, you said he was the only person. So I thought, if he's the only person, someone should probably call him. She looked back at Sunwoo with an expression that clearly communicated she felt the logic was airtight. You didn't sound scary on the phone. I'm not scary, Sunwoo said. Mummy's face says different things about that, Fiona observed. Amy arrived within the hour, cheerful and brisk and asking no questions in a way that meant she was absolutely brimming with them, and sat herself in the chair beside Fiona's bed. You're in good hands, she told Fiona. I brought chocolate. Contraband, Fiona said happily. Cassie and Sunwoo walked the 3 blocks to the cafe on the corner without speaking. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window. The coffee arrived. Neither of them touched it. Cassie studied the grain of the wood table. Sunwoo studied her. She could feel it, that quality of attention he had always had, the kind that made you feel both seen and unsteady. He broke the silence first. How have you been? He asked. And the question was so ordinary, so careful, so completely at odds with the magnitude of what was sitting between them that it disarmed her entirely. She looked at him then, really looked, for the first time since the hospital room, without the shock buffering her vision. He looked older. Not badly. He had grown into his face the way some men did, the angles sharper, the presence denser. He looked like someone who had spent 6 years carrying something heavy and had learned to carry it without showing the strain. She swallowed. She stopped, started again. I've been managing. I have a good job. Fiona is wonderful. I have Amy. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I have been managing. You're not answering the question, he said. She looked up. He held her gaze without apology, and she thought, he still does that. He still looked at her like she was expected to be honest. No, she said quietly. I haven't been, particularly, happy, not the way I... She stopped again. No. He absorbed this. He did not do anything theatrical with it. He simply nodded, once, like he had understood something he needed to understand. Fiona is your daughter, she said. He didn't move. He had known. She could see it, had seen it the moment his eyes had found Fiona's face in that hospital room. But knowing something intellectually and hearing it said aloud were evidently 2 different experiences, because for a moment he was simply still, absolutely still, a man absorbing something tectonic. Why did you leave? He said at last. 3 words, but she could hear everything compressed inside them, the 6 years, the unanswered questions, the wound that had never quite closed. Cassie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and told him. All of it. She told him about his mother coming to the coffee shop near her dormitory, about the photographs of him in Haejin, boardroom events, charity dinners, occasions that had perfectly innocent explanations, but which Soo-yeon had presented with the studied neutrality of someone who understood how context could be weaponized. She told him about the careful, devastating case his mother had made, that Cassie was a distraction, an indulgence, the temporary consequence of a man briefly untethered from his real life. She told him about the suggestion, not a demand, Soo-yeon was too smart for demands, that the kindest thing Cassie could do, if she genuinely loved him, was to set him free. And then the deal fell through, she said. The one with the Lim group. I watched you after you found out. I watched how angry you were, and She exhaled. I had already been told that staying with me was costing you that relationship, and then I saw your face when you lost it, and I read it wrong. I thought you were angry at yourself for what you'd given up to be with me. I thought you were starting to regret it. Sunwoo's jaw worked. I was angry at Haejin's father, he said. I was angry at the politics of it, not at you, never at you. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it then. And by the time I might have reconsidered, she shook her head. I had already sent the message. I had already made you. Her voice fractured just barely. I had already made you believe I didn't want you." The silence between them was different now, less like a wall and more like a wound, something that could possibly be treated. "I found out about Fiona 6 weeks after I got home," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I thought about telling you. I wanted to, but I had sent that message and I couldn't imagine you would want to hear from me after that." Sun Woo was quiet for a long moment. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and she watched something move behind his eyes, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, loosening just slightly. "I never hated you," he said. "I tried. It would have been easier." A pause. "I searched for you. Several times. I know." She had suspected as much. "I made sure you couldn't find me. That was... I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it." He shook his head slowly, not in dismissal, in something more like a refusal to let her carry it all. "My mother," he said, "the things she told you." His jaw tightened. She had no right. "She thought she was protecting you." "She was protecting her ambitions," he said, and his voice had an edge in it now, that familiar blade quality she remembered. "And she cost me 6 years." He looked at her. "She cost both of us." Cassie felt her eyes sting. She pressed her lips together. "I want to give Fiona my blood," he said then. "Whatever she needs, and I want to be part of her life, Cassie, however that looks, whatever shape makes sense. I'm not asking you to change anything that you don't want changed, but I'm not going to disappear from her life. She called me. She needs me, and I—" He stopped. Something flickered in his expression. "I am not going to be absent from my daughter's life." It was the most vulnerable she had ever heard him sound, wrapped in that direct, declarative language of his, but vulnerable underneath. "Of course," Cassie said softly. "Of course, you're her father, Sun Woo. She already called you Daddy on the phone. She's been waiting for you without knowing she was waiting." Something in his face moved that she did not think he had intended her to see. He nodded, reached for his coffee. Just before they rose to go, he said, as if the words had been waiting all evening for this specific moment, "I never had anything to do with Hee-jin, not before you came, and certainly not after you left." He walked ahead, back toward the hospital, leaving Cassie standing still on the pavement with the weight of 6 wasted years pressing down on her, and something that felt dangerously, achingly like hope pressing up against it from the other side. Sun Woo gave his blood. The surgery was scheduled within the hour. Cassie sat in the waiting area with her hands clasped and her head bowed, and Sun Woo sat beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just present, just there. And somehow that was exactly right. The surgeon came out 2 hours later smiling. "She did beautifully," he said. "Strong kid." "She is," Cassie said, and for the first time in hours, her shoulders came down from around her ears. Sun Woo purchased a penthouse in Manhattan the next morning. He told his office in Seoul he was working remotely for the foreseeable future. He said foreseeable future in the tone he used for all his business communications, precise, final, and his assistant, who had worked for him for 4 years and had learned when not to ask follow-up questions, simply said, "Of course, sir." It was summer, which meant no school, which meant that most mornings Cassie dropped Fiona at Sun Woo's penthouse on her way to work, and Fiona, curious, fearless, possessed of an opinion about absolutely everything, began the systematic project of figuring out Park Sun Woo. He did not know what he had been expecting. He was honest enough with himself to admit that he had expected a child he could observe from a careful distance while they both became accustomed to each other. A period of formal adjustment, a scheduled relationship. What he had not expected was Fiona. "Your apartment is very serious," she informed him on the second morning, standing in the center of his living room in her sneakers and her purple backpack, surveying the space with the critical eye of a small architect. "You have no color in here. Everything is gray." "Gray is a perfectly good color," Sun Woo said. "Gray is what happens when you can't decide," Fiona told him, with the certainty of someone who had given this matter extensive thought. He looked at her, this small person who had come into existence without his knowledge, and was now standing in his living room telling him things, and felt something he couldn't quite name. It was a bit like watching something crack open inside himself that he had thought was solid, only to find that what was on the other side of the crack was not loss or damage, but something entirely unexpected, something that looked, embarrassingly, like wonder. By the end of the first week, he had let her put a drawing on the refrigerator. By the end of the second, she had commandeered one of his kitchen shelves for the stuffed elephant she insisted needed its own space. By the third week, she had taught him that her favorite pasta required approximately 30% more butter than any recipe called for, and that the correct ratio of lemon to sugar in her lemonade was a matter of great personal importance. He had never laughed so much in his life. Not this kind of laughter, unplanned, unguarded, the kind that ambushed him when she said something so precisely, hilariously true that his chest did not know what else to do with itself. He took her to the park and to the cinema. He took her to the Museum of Arts, where she stood in front of a Basquiat for 5 full minutes and then announced he was angry about something, but beautifully. He flew her to LA in his private jet to see a stage production she had been talking about and spent the entire flight watching her face more than the window because her excitement was a better view than any city below. He took her to Disneyland. He stood in the queue for the teacups with his hands in his pockets and his expression entirely neutral while every other adult around him wore mouse ears, and Fiona looked up at him and said, "You can have fun, you know. I won't tell anyone." And he had found himself, to his own considerable surprise, genuinely having fun. Fiona catalogued his preferences with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist. "You like documentaries," she informed him one afternoon, settling beside him on the couch with the elephant. "You like them because everything in them is true and people can't argue with you about them." "That's not why I like them," he said. "Okay," she said, with the tone of someone who was not going to pursue the argument because she had already won it. She asked him questions no one else ever asked him. "What do you think about when you wake up in the middle of the night? Did you have a best friend when you were my age? What's the saddest you've ever been?" That one delivered with such matter-of-fact curiosity that he had answered it honestly before he realized he was doing it. He had told her about the months after Cassie left. He had told her in terms appropriate for a 5-year-old, but he had told her the truth of it, that someone very important had gone away, and he had missed her for a long time. Fiona had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "I think Mummy missed you too. She gets a certain face when she talks about Korea, like she swallowed something that didn't go all the way down." He had looked at her. "You notice a lot?" "I notice everything," Fiona said simply. "Most grown-ups don't notice that I notice. I find it useful." He was becoming, it turned out, the fun parent, which was not something he had ever anticipated being. It was not something he had thought himself capable of, and yet here he was, making sweetened lemonade at 7 in the morning and failing to keep a straight face while doing it. And Cassie was watching all of this from the doorway of his kitchen, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, and something in her expression that she was working to keep neutral. She was warm and lovely and quietly, completely wrecked by what she was seeing, and she didn't want him to know it yet. He knew it. He had always been good at reading things, rooms, negotiations, people. But Cassie, he had always read the way he read things he cared about, carefully, attentively, with a quality of focus he reserved for very little else. He saw the way her eyes softened when she watched Fiona with him. He saw the way she bit her lip sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, not nervously, but thoughtfully, like she was editing something she'd almost said. He started inviting her along on afternoons with Fiona. Casually at first, "We're going to the farmer's market, she wants you there," and then less casually, with less pretense of using Fiona as the reason. He started asking her things, how her day was, what she was working on, what she wanted. He started remembering things she said, the coffee she liked, the author she'd mentioned once in passing, the small things, and doing something with that information. She started staying late after dropping Fiona off, finding reasons to linger. She would cook dinner and ask him to stay, and he always did, and they would sit across from each other at her kitchen table and talk long after Fiona had fallen asleep with the stuffed elephant under her arm. They talked the way they used to. Easily, honestly, with the specific intimacy of two people who had somehow, despite everything, already learned each other. One evening, she told him that she had been terrified the first time she had seen him in the hospital doorway. "Not of you," she clarified, turning her wineglass in her hands. "Of what I still felt. I thought I had told myself I had dealt with it, processed it. 6 years is a long time." "Not always long enough," he said. She looked up. He was watching her the way he used to watch her. Not the hardened version of that gaze she had met at the hospital, but the one from before. The one that felt like being held. "No," she agreed softly. "Not always long enough." They were in her living room. The city was doing what cities do in the small hours, humming quietly at the edges, and Cassie looked at him thoughtfully. "I have done this before. I have sat with this man before and felt exactly this. And the strangeness of it was that it didn't feel like starting over. It felt like returning, like something picking up a thread it had never actually dropped. "I kept your number," she said. He was still. "I know. I blocked it." She looked down. "But I kept it. I don't fully know what to do with that information about myself. I've been sitting with it for 6 years. She paused. "I think it means I never entirely believed the decision I made. I think it means I was always—" She stopped, holding the door open, just a little. Sunwoo looked at her for a long moment. She could see the exact moment he decided to say the thing instead of holding it. "When I searched for you," he said slowly. "The first few times, I told myself it was for answers. That I needed to understand why you had done what you did. That I needed closure." His voice was quiet but precise, in the way of someone choosing words with care. "By the third search, I stopped lying to myself about the reason. Cassie's heart was doing something she recognized, something she had spent 6 years telling it not to do. Sunwoo, I'm not asking you to do anything about that right now," he said. It seemed important that you knew what was true for me." He glanced down. "It still is true for me. All of it." He asked her on a date 3 weeks after that conversation. He knocked on her apartment door on a Thursday evening, dressed in the understated, expensive way that was simply how he dressed, and said, "I would like to take you to dinner, not as Fiona's parents, as other things as well." Cassie looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she had always had, the one that had stopped him in his tracks the first time he saw it in a hospital room in Seoul, and said, "Give me 10 minutes." Fiona, who was behind Cassie in the hallway, wearing her pajamas and holding the stuffed elephant, looked at Sunwoo and gave him a very deliberate thumbs up. "Subtle," he told her. "I know what subtle means," Fiona said. "I chose not to use it." There are women who love their children so possessively that the love becomes a kind of violence. Madam Park Soo-yeon had loved Sunwoo this way, completely, and with an absolute certainty that she knew better than he did what his life should look like. She had mapped his future long before he was old enough to have opinions about it, and any deviation from that map was not, in her mind, a matter of his autonomy. It was a malfunction to be corrected. She had been watching from Seoul. She had known about Fiona, had known for some time through the private contacts she had maintained without her son's knowledge, because Soo-yeon was nothing if not thorough. She had kept it from him. She had told herself this was strategy, but the truth she would never have admitted was simpler and uglier. She had known that if Sunwoo found out about his child, nothing she said or did would matter anymore. Now they were growing close again, Sunwoo and Cassie and the little girl. And Soo-yeon could feel the future she had planned for her son crumbling at the edges. The wedding she had imagined, the alliance with the Lim family, all of it dissolving in the face of a woman who had come back into his life with a child and a smile and 25 words that could apparently undo everything Soo-yeon had spent years constructing. She had one advantage, she realized. She was willing to do what Sun-woo, for all his ruthlessness in business, would not do. She was willing to hurt people. She began to plan. 3 months after their first dinner date, 3 months of slowly, deliberately, carefully rebuilding what had been interrupted, of Sun-woo reaching out tentatively, and then with more certainty, and Cassie meeting him there. He proposed. He did not do it grandly. He was not, at his core, a grand gesture kind of man. He did it at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning, while Fiona was still asleep, and the light coming through the window was the particular pale gold of early autumn. He put the ring on the table between them and said, "I have not stopped loving you. I tried. I told you that. But I want to stop trying. I want to stop pretending that 6 years of stubbornness is the same thing as moving on." Cassie looked at the ring, looked at him. She thought about the hospital room. She thought about the cafe. She thought about the dozens of ordinary evenings that had built themselves, quietly and without announcement, into something she understood now was the foundation of a life. "Yes," she said. "Sun-woo, yes." Fiona, who had gotten up to get a glass of water and arrived in the kitchen doorway at precisely this moment, processed the scene with her usual uncanny speed and announced, "Finally," with a volume significantly at odds with the intimacy of the moment. Sun-woo pressed his lips together. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Fiona said, climbing into the chair beside him and examining the ring with the expression of a jeweler assessing a stone. "It's nice. I picked something bigger, but this is nice." "You—" Cassie looked at Sun-woo. "She may have provided some input," he admitted. Fiona nodded serenely. "He asked for my advice. I am an excellent advisor." They had a small celebration, just the 3 of them, their family, the only shape that mattered, at Cassie's favorite restaurant in New York. Sun-woo watched them across the table, his daughter explaining something to the waiter with characteristic authority, Cassie laughing and covering her face with her hand, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for years. Something that recognized, this is it. This is the thing. They began to plan the wedding. Cassie started processing a transfer to her company's Seoul branch. Fiona was told she would be the flower girl and accepted this responsibility with the gravity of a small general being given command of an army. Sun-woo flew back to Korea to begin preparations. He would be there a week, 2 at most. He was wrong about the timeline. It happened the morning Cassie and Fiona went to the wedding dress boutique. They had spent an hour and a half in the shop, Fiona providing her opinions on every dress with unwavering confidence, Cassie laughing and occasionally actually taking the opinions into account, because Fiona had a surprisingly good eye. And they left in good spirits, walking toward the mall, Fiona's hand tucked in Cassie's. The van appeared from the side street, fast, too fast. There were 2 men. It was over in seconds. One of them had Fiona, and the van door was closing, and Cassie was running after it, screaming her daughter's name, and then the van was gone. A stolen car, no plate she could read, just the street and her own ragged breathing and the place where her daughter had been. She called the police with hands she could not make stop shaking. Then she called Sun-woo. He picked up on the second ring. "Sun-woo." Her voice broke on his name. Just that, just his name, broken in half. Cassie, immediate, fully present. "What happened?" she told him. She heard something happen in him on the other end of the line, not words, just a sound, like something giving way under pressure. Then, "I'm on my way. I am on my way right now. Cassie, do you hear me? I'm coming. Please," she said. That was all she could manage. She heard him moving, heard him calling out to someone in the background. "Do not go anywhere alone," he told her. "Call Amy. Call someone. I will be there tonight." He was there by evening. She knew the moment the door opened, knew it in the way her body had always recognized him before the rest of her caught up. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and she came apart. 6 years of self-sufficiency, of handling everything alone, of not leaning, gone. She pressed her face against his chest and cried with the kind of abandon that only comes when you finally trust someone enough to fall. He held her. He did not say it's going to be fine. He didn't know if it would be, and he wouldn't lie to her. He just held her, one hand against the back of her head, and let her fall and caught her while she did. He had already set his men to work on leads. He was doing everything that could be done, but the police had nothing: a stolen vehicle, no witnesses, and the hours were long and terrible, and Cassie sat in her apartment in the specific hell of a mother who does not know where her child is. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered before the second ring. "Cassandra, darling." The voice was honey and acid, and Cassie knew it immediately, 6 years notwithstanding. Her body went cold. Her mind went very, very clear. "I trust you've had time to think." "Where is my daughter?" Cassie said. Her voice was quiet. It was the quietest she had ever sounded. "Safe," Soo-yeon said pleasantly. "For now. Her continued safety is entirely in your hands." "What do you want?" "The same thing I have always wanted, dear." A pause, theatrical, calculated. "For you to leave my son, permanently. This time with no possibility of return. I want you to break the engagement. I want Sunwoo to believe beyond any recovery that you don't want him. I want him to hate you this time, not grieve, hate. You understand the distinction?" Cassie closed her eyes. She understood. "And if I do this," she said, "you'll give Fiona back." "Of course. Along with 2 one-way tickets for you and Fiona to wherever you'd like to go, far from Seoul, far from Sunwoo. And enough money to establish yourself comfortably. Think of it as a gift." Another pause. "Or think of it as a warning about what happens if you don't comply. Either framing works for me." "You have 1 hour to decide, and then I'll tell you exactly where I'm keeping your daughter," Soo-yeon said. "Tell no one, especially not Sunwoo. If I sense any involvement from him, I'll make sure you never see Fiona again." The line went dead. Cassie sat with the phone in her hands. She thought about Fiona. She thought about the night Fiona had called a stranger named Sunwoo and asked him for his blood because she had overheard a conversation and decided, with 5-year-old certainty, that this was a problem that had a solution and she was going to find it. She thought about Sunwoo standing at the altar of that almost life she had been building. There was no way she could ever hurt him like that again, and she couldn't imagine losing her daughter either. She was ready to fight for her family, even if it took everything she had. She picked up the phone and dialed the unknown number back. The door to Soo-yeon's secret apartment opened. Soo-yeon, who had been sitting in a chair waiting for Cassie, looked up. She had expected Cassie alone. She had expected a woman who had chosen her daughter over her love, arriving to confirm the terms of her surrender. She had arranged her expression accordingly. Gracious, magnanimous, the expression of someone granting a mercy. What she got was Sunwoo, beside Cassie, not behind her, beside her, looking at his mother the way she had never once seen him look at anyone. "Sunwoo," she began. He walked past her. In the back room, Fiona sat on a cot with her arms crossed and the stuffed elephant on her lap, and an expression that managed to be simultaneously affronted, relieved, and entirely composed. She looked up when Sunwoo appeared in the doorway, and something in her small face shifted. Something came undone, briefly, before she pulled it back together. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was almost steady. Almost. "I'm here," he said, and knelt down, and she came off the cot and into his arms, like something released from a long tension. "I was brave," she informed his shoulder. "Like the princess in the story you told me. The one who waits in the tower and isn't actually waiting, she's just making a plan." "You were exactly like her," he said. His voice was not quite steady either. "Oh, Fiona. My brave girl." Cassie crossed the room and folded herself around both of them, her arms going over Sunwoo's, her face pressing into Fiona's hair. And for a moment the 3 of them were simply still. Together, real, present. When Sunwoo turned to face his mother, his expression had rearranged itself into something formal and final. Soo-yeon tried several things. She tried confusion, claiming she didn't know what was happening. She tried tears, which would have been more persuasive if she had not been so clearly calculating the exact moment to deploy them. She tried telling him that Cassie had orchestrated the entire thing as a way to turn him against her. Sun Woo gave a condescending chuckle, reaching into his jacket and produced his phone. A few clicks on his phone and a recording began to play. It was the recorded call between Cassie and Soo-yeon that Cassie had made. Although she had been in disbelief and caught completely off guard during the first call, just before the second call, Cassie had gathered her bearings and made her decision on what she had to do to protect her family, so she has pressed record just before dialing the unknown number. When Cassie had played the recording to Sun Woo after he had returned home, he had been in utter disbelief. He couldn't believe his mother would ever do such a thing. Earlier that year, after he had discovered what she had told Cassie 6 years ago, he had confronted her and warned her that if she ever meddled in his life, especially in regard to Cassie, he would never forgive her. Apparently, it had become clear to him that his warning to her had fallen on deaf ears. His mother's voice filled the apartment. Every word, the threats, the instructions, the breezy confidence of a woman who believed herself to be unrecordable. When it ended, the silence was significant. "She told me about 6 years ago," Sun Woo said. His voice was very quiet. "What you did to Cassie, what you told her, I warned you. I made it clear what would happen if you tried any devious scheme again." He paused. "Apparently I wasn't specific enough." "Sun Woo!" "I'm not calling the police," he said. "That would be in the newspapers. Fiona would eventually read it. She doesn't need that." He looked at his mother with something that was not anger anymore, something colder and more final than anger. "But as of tonight, I have no affiliation with you. None. You are not my family." Soo-yeon's face crumpled. "Sun Woo, please." "Before morning," he continued, "you will transfer your majority shares to Fiona's name and relinquish your CEO position at the subsidiary to Cassie. You have lawyers. They know how to do this quickly. If I don't have confirmation by 9 a.m., I will file a kidnapping report with everything I have." The silence in the room was absolute. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I would protect my daughter," he said simply, "from anyone." Madam Park Soo-yeon, who had spent 30 years accumulating the wealth and position that constituted her entire identity, stood in the center of the room and crumbled. Not quickly. It happened slowly, the way expensive things fall, in stages. She wept. She was still weeping when Sun Woo guided Cassie and Fiona out of the apartment and into the car waiting at the curb. Fiona, looking out the window as they drove away, said very seriously, "I think she made some bad choices." "She did," Sun Woo said. "My teacher says people can learn from bad choices," Fiona offered. "But she also says some people don't." "Also true," he agreed. Fiona thought about this. "I think your mummy is in the second group." Sun Woo looked at her in the rearview mirror for a moment. Then, for the first time in hours, he smiled. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the share transfers were confirmed. Madam Park Soo-yeon vacated her position, her apartment, and the country within a week. Sun Woo did not hear from her again, and he chose not to go looking for news of her. He had said what he needed to say. The chapter was closed. 3 months later, Park Sun-woo stood at the altar of a ceremony hall in Seoul that Cassie had chosen for its light, floor-to-ceiling windows, the autumn city beyond them, afternoon sun coming in at a long angle that turned everything golden. He stood at the front in a dark suit and the particular expression of a man trying to maintain composure and not entirely succeeding. Music began to play. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. In came Fiona. She was 6 years old and wearing a dress the color of cream and carrying a basket of flower petals with the seriousness of a head of state. She had insisted on practicing the walk 17 times the night before. She had timed herself. She had given Sun-woo a detailed critique of his standing posture. "You look like you're about to negotiate something. Soften your face." And had advised Cassie on the precise angle at which to hold her bouquet. Now she walked down the aisle, dropping petals with rhythmic precision, her face composed, her eyes tracking the attendees with a kind of sociological curiosity. She reached the altar and took her position beside her father. Then she looked up at him with those eyes, his eyes, in her mother's face, and she said in a stage whisper that carried perfectly, "I told you it would work out." He could not trust himself to reply. He put his hand very briefly on the top of her head, and she allowed it. The doors opened again. Cassie walked through them. She was holding a bouquet of something soft and pale, and her hair was up, and she was looking at him from the length of the aisle with an expression that he felt in his sternum. He thought, as she walked toward him, of a rainy street in Seoul 6 years ago, of her voice telling him to stay with her, of a hospital room and a cafe table and 100 small evenings that had built themselves, gradually and without announcement, into this. Into her. Into all of it. She reached him. He took her hand. "You look ethereal," he said, and his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "How could I ever be this lucky?" "Yes, Mummy," Fiona added from her position to his left, at a volume that the entire hall could hear. "You look like an angel. All you need now are wings." Laughter moved through the room, warm, real, the kind of laughter that belongs in the space between tears. Cassie pressed her free hand over her mouth. Sunwoo felt it rise in him too, that unguarded, unplanned laughter that Fiona had been ambushing him with since the first morning she stood in his gray apartment and told him it needed color. He was right. It needed color. They said their vows. He said his without looking away from her face, and she said hers with her eyes bright and her voice steady, and the words between them had the quality of things that had been true for longer than they had been spoken. The ring went on. They were told to kiss. Fiona made a sound of considerable satisfaction, and then they were walking back down the aisle, the three of them because Fiona had taken both their hands, into the light of the hall and the sound of the room celebrating and the beginning of a life that had cost them everything and was now, somehow, entirely theirs. Later, at the reception, Fiona was discovered sitting between two of Sunwoo's business associates, explaining to them the importance of O-negative blood type and the proper procedure for filing a kidnapping report, which she had done extensive research on and felt they should know about. Sunwoo extracted her from this conversation. She went without argument, which meant she felt she had made her most important points. "You can't go around telling people about the kidnapping," he told her. "I wasn't telling them about the kidnapping," she said patiently. "I was educating them. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes, education is valuable." She looked up at him. "Daddy, are you happy?" He looked across the room at Cassie, who was laughing with Amy, her head tilted back, entirely herself, entirely present. "Yes," he said. There was nothing complicated about the answer. There never had been. "I'm very happy." Fiona nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has run all the relevant calculations and found the answer correct. "Me too," she said. "Can I have cake now?" "You can have cake now," he said. She took his hand and pulled him toward the dessert table, and he went. Park Sun-woo, who moved through boardrooms like weather, who had built an empire from the ruins of someone else's failure, who had spent 6 years behind walls of his own construction, he went, pulled along by a 6-year-old girl who had unblocked a number in the middle of the night and called a stranger and asked for his blood. He thought it was probably the most important phone call anyone had ever made, and it was. The end. And that is how a love broken by lies found its way back through a child who refused to give up, from one rainy night in Seoul, to 6 years of silence, to a little girl who made one life-changing call. This wasn't just love. It was fate, sacrifice, and a second chance that almost came too late. Now I want to hear from you. If you were Cassie, would you have left to protect the man you loved? If you were Sunwoo, could you forgive 6 years of silence? And be honest, did Fiona steal the entire story for you? Drop your thoughts below. I read them all. And if this story moved you even a little, go ahead and hit like. It helps more people discover stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe to Afro-Korean romance cinema for more powerful emotional love stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss what's next, because the next story, you won't want to miss it. Until then, believe in love that finds its way back.